This lecture is focused on dramatism. What is dramatism? We'll get into it, but it's an analytical perspective which originated via Kenneth Burke, who was a fascinating character and a major figure in modern rhetoric. Keywords will be action, consubstantiality, dramatism, motion, pentad, and terministic screen. Hauser sets the tone on page 201 when he writes that, quote, "Whenever symbols encourage us to share our attitudes, they are functioning rhetorically. This broader scope represents a new point of view. Contemporary rhetoricians have shifted their focus from persuasion to identification. This change-up, wherein we focus on identification, lets us reevaluate the important role of both persuasion and how we use language in a persuasive way. Language thus exists as a tool for action. Question 1. What's the difference between motion and action? Hauser writes about the moon, noting, quote, "The moon takes on symbolic significance and is thereby transferred from the realm of motion to the realm of action, the realm of our attitudes, where we attach interpretations to the raw data of existence. It no longer is what it is what we make of it." So we can see nature existing in a state of motion. Our hearts beat, our eyes blink, rivers and tributaries flow into oceans. That's all motion. Action, however, in Hauser's words, indicates, quote, "the realm of meaning in which humans use symbols, dance, painting, speech, writing, languages in general. Symbols give objects of nature transport to the realm of action, meaning that goes beyond their physical properties. We can't just reduce them to physical aspects of themselves. Action, in the sense that Burke writes about, and that Hauser is expounding upon, refers to the type of behavior that becomes possible with the use of symbols. Burke put forward 3 rules here that are important. Number 1, there can be no action without motion. Number 2, there can be motion without action. Number 3, action is not reducible to terms of motion. Hauser looks at various schools of thought, but focuses on how we act by way of using language. Kenneth Burke, a self-taught scholar and author of several notable books on rhetoric, created a theory called Dramatism, which analyzed how human beings act with language, and it's based upon the dramatic actions we see on stages. So we've talked about symbols, and symbols were a big deal for Burke. Burke believed that humans were special because we're a symbol-using animal. We deploy symbols in all kinds of situations. We coordinate and collaborate through the use of language and symbols. But what's more is that we can share motivations and use them to get on the same page. We can build empathy and communicate important ideas through language and through symbols. But why is this the case? Why do Burke's claims make sense? As Hauser states, it's because of Burke's idea that, quote, "we are able to coordinate our social lives only because we construct our social realities through symbols." You'll see on page 204 that Burke had a real, way with words. Check out how he defined the human: as a symbol-using or misusing animal, as an inventor of, or as invented by, the negative, as separated from his natural condition by instruments of his own making, as goaded by a spirit of hierarchy, and, here's the fun one, as rotten with perfection. Burke wrote about the human condition and the human tendency to use language in certain ways. In Hauser's reading, he digs into these aspects of human beings and how it relates to rhetoric and Burke's thoughts on communication. This is all stuff you should be reading, but we use symbols, craft them, and can also employ negativity negation, which is why Hauser writes on page 205 that, quote, "the use of the negative to criticize choices anchors our morality as ethical creatures in our ability to use symbols." Question 2. In Burke's sense of the term, can you identify with somebody who doesn't speak your language? We're also separated from ourselves, according to Burke, and technology is a key example of this separation. Burke was firmly anti-technology in a lot of senses. We can think of language in the same way. It can also help us survive, but can also destroy us. In our lives as social, symbol-using animals, hierarchy also plays a role. We have to acknowledge differences in language and symbols, and values and valuations can be introduced here. These in turn act as structures which influence our communication and our interactions, putting things in an order, be it ideal or otherwise. And then we get to that weird last bit there. Rotten with perfection. We're out there trying to get to the perfect, to the ideal, to the very best things can be. We get so deep into the action that we spend our lives performing it. Hauser writes on page 206 that, in Burke's words, we are rotten with the spirit of perfection as we seek the logical extension of some principle, positive or negative. We can spend our whole lives perfecting our performance through symbols. Perfection in work, in relationships, in performing a skill. Intense, yeah? Symbols do things. We create, destroy, alter, and do a lot with them. Hauser writes, quote, Because we are symbol-using animals and because we are uniquely able to respond to symbols, we are able to act with symbols. But he also notes how we have to act as detectives. Hauser talks about how a rhetorical approach looks at communication as a presentation of reality, wherein, quote, communication is the act of inducing and coordinating social actions through the use of symbols. Symbolic forms express meanings. When we use expressive forms, we create meanings with others. And then we're back to symbols again, as Hauser also notes, quote, a rhetorical perspective views communication as presenting a reality through the organizing and projecting power of symbols. And finally, Hauser writes about how the, quote, presentational character of communication stems from the situated context in which communication occurs. Context will greatly impact our communicative choices, and we can see them as being regulated to some degree by context. Hauser brings us back to dramatism on page 208, writing how, quote, we need a model that best shows the presentational character of communication as a symbolic action, meaning dramatism. He claims, dramatism examines the ways in which we use language in the format of dramatic action. So how might we look at why humans do what they do? How can we gain insight into motives and see how humans perform and justify their performance? Enter the dramatic pentad. So, for many people, the dramatic pentad was Burke's key idea, and it's a thrilling one. It looks at acts, scenes, agents, agency, and purpose to offer what Hauser calls a, quote, complete description of the relevant aspects of a symbolic interaction. They are conceptual tools used to discover the facts about any communicative act, and to put those facts in relationship to one another in a way that provides a plausible explanation for what happened, how it happened, and the motivational urges that account for why it happened. We act out of motive, and we could use the pentad to figure out motives. Hauser writes about how attitude plays a role here too, as symbolic acts convey an attitude toward a disposition. So all this means that rhetoric is getting bigger and bigger, and we're utilizing a presentational view. So what else can we look at if we're hoping to look at all these symbolic activities? Well, in a word, we could look at motives. Hauser writes, quote, by adopting a presentational view of communication, we assume that people reveal their motives by the ways they bond to one another. Motives are observable in the ways we use language and, therefore, are available to anyone who cares to look for them. Motives are also present in everyone's use of language and are the source material from which rhetoric develops. There's a large section of the reading where Hauser writes through a bunch of situations and contexts and talks about how we may react to them. Our habits, our obligations, and our possible tendencies or predispositions are covered as well. He does so to note how we gain orientations through motives, and how our use of symbols in certain ways puts forward a certain version of reality, or certain versions of reality. Hauser writes, quote, through the process of socialization, we learn a vocabulary of motive terms. In fact, we learn several vocabularies, of home, family, and neighborhood, of friends, of school, of subcultures. We learn a vocabulary of motives. We have learned what counts as a legitimate way to resolve life's conflicts for people who use that vocabulary. In a sense, we learn to speak that language and, by speaking the language, to become a member of the group. Question 3. Do you think identification is really important in terms of rhetoric? Why or why not? Stepping back from all this, we're talking about a lot of things. The nature of human beings, motives, stage drama, context. How does this relate to rhetoric? Let's double all the way back and look at why this is important to rhetoric. Fortunately, that's pretty easy. You know how Aristotle said we should let rhetoric be a survey of the available means of persuasion? Well, Burke knocked that idea out of the frame. He argued identification was the basis of the rhetorical function of symbolic acts. It's not quite, I recognize that logo on that t-shirt, as much as it is, I recognize the tendency to wear t-shirts, because it's something we do and it's hot out there and you don't want to get sunburned. Although yeah, we could also just enjoy good graphic design. This is a key component of Burke's philosophy of rhetoric. Identification furthermore implies division. Hauser writes on page 214 that, quote, the rhetorical dimension of symbol use always involves the movement of identifying and dividing. But more than that, rhetoric also overcomes or compensates for division. We need rhetorical uses of language precisely because we are not united with each other. With identification, we're always joining and dividing, aligning and realigning, performing acts of calculus, seeing where we stand and where we don't. Political speeches are a great example of this. They use terms like us, we, them, we are going to do this versus they're going to do that. We're being asked to identify with something. Those are acts of identification through division. Keep in mind here that, as Hauser notes, we can also misidentify things. Hauser writes about how we can have a vocabulary of motives with which to build a massive common framework, and he extrapolates this by writing about capitalist systems as an example, which Burke did as well. Shifting into a conceptual pattern, through which we can interpret reality, would be the use of a deterministic screen, which emphasizes some aspects of a vocabulary of motives, while minimizing the importance of others. And this gets us to our last keyword. Quote, "This oneness in principle that underlies identification is called consubstantiality. Consubstantiality means there's an essential commonality which can be or is shared with one another. Consubstantiality, being of the same substance, or being with the same substance." Hauser's summary on page 217 offers a nice wrap-up of all this, and the next lecture will deal with how some of these thoughts can be applied to rhetorical studies in novel ways. Until then, see you online, and take care of yourselves.